Okay, I think there are still a few more folks still making their way in, but I guess we can start with a little introduction. If you're not already aware, this is Burdock Group's webinar series, and this is going to be about GRAS, AAFCO, or FAP, which option works best for your novel feed ingredient. And my name is John Alagbon. I am a business development executive at the company, and I've been around for about 3 years now, and I have a background in molecular biology and marine biology. And our company has experience in not only animal feed, but also human food, dietary supplements, as well as EPA regulation. So we've been working with GRAS for quite a while, as well as different FDA regulations. So yeah, with that, let's get started. Okay, so I guess the first thing we have to mention is kind of the roadmap of what we're going to take on today's presentation. So I guess, I've divided it down into 4 sections: who regulates animal feed, definition of animal feed, multiple paths to animal feed ingredient compliance, addressing the 3 options we have above, and kind of a brief breakdown of what path works best for you. So onto the first section: who regulates animal feed? Now, I guess we can start from the big picture and starting from how legislation works. So first, there's a need, and that need manifests itself in becoming a bill that a congressman brings to the floor, and with enough votes, it becomes legislation that the president signs, and basically after that, it's law. And that law then comes down to agencies to enforce. And in the case of food, animal feed, it's FDA. Now, the way that they regulate is they propose regulations and rules. So these are similar to laws, but they are kind of the realization of the law. So it's a little bit more nuanced and more specific to situations. Now, when they're proposing rules, they have to have a notice and comment process where they let people take a look at the draft and people make comments, and there's revisions and back and forth. So after that, it gets finalized and there's regulations, and that is the interpretation of the law. I apologize in advance to any attorneys out there if I am misspeaking. But anyway, so moving on. Once you have the revised final regulation after the comment period, it's a regulation, and consumers and manufacturers and industry must abide by it. Now, if there's a dispute and there's dispute about how it's interpreted, you can take it to the court system, judicial system, and from there they make an interpretation and a ruling and a decision on how the regulation should be interpreted, and that decision plays a role in how FDA or the regulatory agency is enforcing that law or that regulation. So with that, there's kind of a little push-pull here. So what's important to know is that if there's a regulation, guidance must not be over compensating for the regulation. It must not be draconian, like what we have here, but basically what it means is that the agency cannot replace rulemaking in the process of notice and comment period and interacting with consumers with guidance. They have to make rules, and President Trump had an executive order making sure that agencies cannot do this. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of laws, regulations, or at least a very high level perspective on it, let's take a look at FDA, the agency that regulates our animal feed. Now, there's 2 sides to this. On the left side is your Office of Foods and Veterinary Medicine. And on the right side, you have Office of Medical Products and Tobacco. So let's just make our way down the right side. So on the right side, you have eventually making way down to human drugs. Now on the left side, it branches out a bit. So on one hand, you have the Center of Food Safety and Nutrition, which is the human food regulatory side or department with an FDA that regulates that. Under that blanket is human food, food ingredients, and dietary supplements. And on the left side of that, Center of Veterinary Medicine, CVM. And this is the department that's responsible for animal feed, pet food, food and feed ingredients, and animal drugs. Now, what makes this different than the human side is that, as you can see, human drugs is in a completely different branch of FDA. Food and human drugs are completely different branches of FDA, whereas in animal feed, they are the same. So that has kind of an interpretation on how their review process is. It's a little bit more integrated there. Now, if you go down, there's a few different categories of animal feed, obviously food and feed ingredients and medicated feed, as well as drugs. So one important thing to note too is that dietary supplement regulations, or DSHEA, do not apply to animal feed ingredients. Okay, so I guess we really got that regulatory overview. Let's move on. What is animal feed? Well, the term food means articles used for food or drink for man or other animals, chewing gum and articles used for components of any such article. So animal feed is actually a subsection of food, and therefore food regulations apply to animal feed as well as human food. And these are a few types of animal food ingredients. At the top, you have food additives, generally recognized as safe ingredients, prior sanctioned ingredients, secondary food ingredients, and processing aids. And these next subsequent ones are not our animal feed ingredients. So you don't have color additives or dietary ingredients, like I mentioned earlier. However, there are nutrient ingredients or dosage form products, and it's kind of a unique little area of animal feed or pet food. And if you want to know more about it, I highly recommend reaching out to Bill Bookout at NASC, and he will give you the grand tour of dosage form products. Yeah, okay. But just remember, dietary supplement regulations do not apply to animal feed, so that it means that you can't do structure function claims as well. Okay, moving on, forage. So that's another type of, these are a little bit more specific. So that means hay, alfalfa, your standard, pasture or grazing animal food. Nutritive substances, things like proteins, fats, carbs, macronutrients, things that you would put within pet food. And medicated feeds, as well as a few other categories near the bottom. But as I reiterate again, there are no medical foods, no dietary supplements for animals. However, there's another interesting caveat here, which is actually very important. This highlighted area I have here is basically stating that if a feed ingredient contributes to the production of an animal, it is considered a drug. So what that basically means is if you have cows or chickens and you're saying that your animal food or your animal feed is increasing the size or increasing growth of the animal, you're technically making a drug claim. And technically, because of that, your animal feed ingredient is considered a drug. So be very careful of what you say. And I think a lot of this has to do with, that connection between the animal food and drug side of how FDA is regulated. There's a lot more overlap there, and it's not beneficial for animal feed producers because they are kind of upheld to the standard of drugs in many cases. Okay, so we have a few more things to go over before we can start getting into recommendations, but let's talk about the 3 different approval processes, or maybe you can say 3.5 different approval processes within the animal feed industry. So there's the feed additive petition, number 1. Generally recognized as safe, as many of you guys know, as well as AAFCO ingredient definitions under state control. What is an FAP? Starting at the top, the term food additive means any substance intended use of which results or may reasonably be expected to result directly or indirectly in its becoming a component or otherwise affecting the characteristics of any food. So you can see in the parentheses that there are many, many different parts of food. So let's talk about what's not a food additive. A GRAS substance, for instance, a pesticide, chemical residue, or a color additive. So let's talk about kind of the approval process for FAP. Now, when you're moving through this, we're starting with the candidate ingredient, and what you do is you get a dossier, right? But what you should do with the food additive petitions is that you meet with FDA first. That's probably the most efficient way to handle an FAP because it's kind of an iterative process where you're really working with FDA. And so you work with FDA, you meet with them, you kind of propose your plan. You want to make sure that you are not asking for permission or leaving it open-ended, but you have a solid direction of what you're going to do. Then you create your food additive petition dossier. Now, regardless of any of the paths that you are choosing, you're going to have scientific data, and a food additive petition is no exception to that. And in many ways, it's more robust simply because it's directly with FDA. So you keep moving down. You fulfill the criteria of CVM, whatever they told you to do based on the suggestion. And because it's a regulation, that's a diagram I showed you in the beginning of how you make a rule, it is going through the proposed rule and comment period. Once they have discussion, make revisions, then it becomes the final rule in the Federal Register. And I think a thing on the right to notice is that it takes, well, FDA says 3 to 5 years, but usually from our experience, the whole process to approval takes about 5 to 8 years. So be prepared for a wait. So what is GRAS? The term food additive means any substance of intended use of which results, okay, we talked about this, but let's go to the bold section. If such substance is not generally recognized among experts qualified by scientific training and experience to evaluate safety as having been shown adequate through scientific procedures or historical use, essentially. So basically, it's one or the other. In federal law, you're either an approved food additive or you are a substance that is generally recognized as safe among qualified experts. So there's a lot to read in here, but with this one paragraph, there's actually a lot that's been derived from it. So let's talk about safety. So safety means that there is a reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that the substance is not harmful under the intended conditions of use. So basically, you have to make sure that you have good and adequate safety data to show that, hey, this product's not going to kill anybody. So, if you go down to number 3, one of the things that that's underlined that's important to note is that experts qualified by scientific training and experience, and you saw that on the CFR entry in the previous slide. So experts in the bolded area, qualified by scientific training. So that we'll get to that in a second, but that's key. So, if it's one or the other, FAP or GRAS, what are the differences? And well, there are quite a bit of differences. We'll get to that in a bit, but in terms of safety and making sure you show safety, there should be no difference. GRAS substance is neither more safe nor less safe than an approved food additive. And I think the biggest difference is that there's a common knowledge of safety within the expert community, i.e., for example, that there has been a lot of publications on it. There's been an expert panel that's reviewed it for thoroughness, and it's generally recognized. So as I mentioned, we get to the meaning of experts. There's a few things here that's mentioning about experts, but so it's a little vague and left to interpretation, but excuse me, you have to make sure that they're qualified by scientific training and experience to evaluate safety. So if you have a GRAS dossier and you are having an expert panel or a panel of experts to make that general recognition portion of it, if you have a poultry ingredient, you certainly don't want a physician or nephrologist being an expert. They have nothing to do with poultry. So you have to be very careful about that. So a couple other things when it comes to experts. Safe for safety means that there is reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that the substance is not harmful under the intended conditions of use. So once again, it's reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists. So I mean, competent is, I guess, is up to interpretation of many people. I would argue that competent does not include, a person that is, well, I mean, they are competent, but you shouldn't be using an expert that's a colleague of yours. If you have a GRAS dossier, a colleague of yours, a coworker of yours that has, some conflict of interest. And in continuing, safety factors, which in the opinion of experts qualified by scientific training, experience, to evaluate the safety of food and food ingredients, are generally recognized as appropriate. Okay, moving on. So let's look at the process like we had earlier with previous FAP. So once again, there's two paths that are federally recognized. There's general recognition of safe and FAP. So the one we're going to talk about is GRAS by scientific procedures, because the other one, which is history of use, is very difficult to find for animal feed. And I guess we can talk about that, but it's rarely used nowadays. But it's very similar in how it's structured. You have to make sure you have adequate scientific data. CVM insists that you need to have the same quality and quantity of data for FAP and GRAS. And however, the biggest difference, if you keep working your way down after scientific data review, is that this is reviewed by experts. And it goes back to what we were talking about, expert panelists and of industry who are basically saying that, we think this is safe for its intended use. So once that happens, the experts agree, the panel agrees, this is non-FDA, ingredient is GRAS. Now, you don't have to notify the FDA, but you can, and a lot of people choose to. And that I think we're going to get into that a little bit later, but the biggest difference that you can see here is kind of, not in terms of content, but more in terms of the approval process. CVM approves one, which is the food additive petition. It's very much you holding CVM's hand. And whereas GRAS is really more industry, and you're a little left more to your devices and interpretation. And experts are the ones approving it, so to speak. However, you can notify the CVM, and many times it's a good idea. As I mentioned, there's also the option of history of use. If it's documented history of use prior to January 1st, 1958, and experts agree that this safety data is adequate to show safety and use, it is GRAS. You can get GRAS for it that way. But it is very difficult to find solid technical data prior to January 1st, 1958. So it doesn't happen very often. Okay, so the third route is AAFCO. And we'll talk about that one more in greater detail. Okay, so what is AAFCO and how does it work? So let's give a background on it. It was formed in 1909 to achieve a level of playing field among states, creating definitions for ingredients. And different states accept different publications of the OP. Some states have 2017, some states have 2019. It's a little bit up to their own interpretation, what they want. And what it's made out of, AAFCO, it's made out of feed control officials from all states. However, it is not a regulatory agency. It's not a federal agency. It is not equivalent to FDA. The power that they have as an organization is within their own state. Now, I mentioned the OP, official publication, a number of times. What this is basically it's a compendium of, I guess, the regulations that AAFCO, the organization, abides by. So they have a lot of details regarding labeling, manufacturing processes, and most importantly for our purposes, definitions, ingredient definitions, which in many ways can be equated to, I guess, an alternate process to FAPs and GRAS. Now, moving down to the fourth bullet point, AAFCO, as I mentioned earlier, was formed in 1909, but the FD&C Act was passed in 1958. So basically, AAFCO got there first. So there's this interesting dynamic there, and we've been kind of coexisting, even if FDA is technically regulating animal feed. So is AAFCO, and more on that later. So another key thing to know about AAFCO is that in 2007, there was a memorandum of understanding that signals the ability for CVM to end the relationship with AAFCO. So what is AAFCO? I think, well, I mentioned it's a group of state regulators But let's talk specifically about how ingredients are approved, much like the flowcharts we saw earlier. So the chair of the ingredient committee, I believe it's Richard Tenike from Oregon, wonderful guy. And he brings an ingredient to the initial committee, or to the committee, the ingredient definitions committee, to review. And if you ever go to an AAFCO meeting, that is the place to be. That is where all the cool kids attend, because everyone's super interested. So basically, the committee reviews it, and they come up with a decision, and then they hand it over to CVM. So this is kind of where it's tricky. So while AAFCO is an independent private organization, they are working with CVM to make sure that they can, I guess, get some sort of federal buy-in based on the MOU. So CVM's technically part of this and technically providing feedback. And I guess a note on that and how that works is they're using a concept called enforcement discretion. And well, they're basically the agency, FDA, is supposed to be enforcing, the law, which is basically saying FAP or GRAS only, right? But, because they're using enforcement discretion, basically meaning they're not choosing to enforce, they are allowing AAFCO to regulate. And this is outlined in that memorandum of understanding. And if you're interested in that, and have 4 hours, I highly recommend reaching out to Dr. Burdock and listening to his history lesson. Okay. Anyway, so I mentioned earlier that this MOU was to acknowledge and to formally acknowledge the working of CVM with AAFCO. But it's also supposed to indicate that cooperation is supposed to be coming to an end in 2007. However, it's never been ended. So we're kind of in this purgatory, if you will, of dual cooperative regulation. So after CVM reviews, they give it back to the committee, they approve it, and there's a vote by general membership, and the ingredient is published within the OP. So, I think the online resources have changed this a bit. Oh, let me move over. I think online resources have changed this a bit, but I believe that the way that they get approval is that it happens every 6 months at the general meetings as well as the mid-year meetings, where they have a tentative definition, basically saying, okay, well, I think we've got this approved, but we got a tentative definition for a year or 6 months, I believe, and at the next meeting we're gonna get we're gonna finalize it. Once again, talk to Dr. Burdock. Okay, so I guess there's a lot of questions here, right? This is a private organization, so what kind of regulatory authority does it have? Well, technically, I guess it really doesn't, but it kind of does. It basically means that if you are going this route, you are not technically federally compliant. You're only not being, enforced, or not being, I don't want to say prosecuted, but you're not being picked on, so to speak, by CVM. They're just letting it go. So anyway, moving on. So this is a few general takeaways from those 3 paths. While an animal feed is considered food by FDA and thus subject to GRAS and food additive regulations, they are regulated by different branches of FDA with different perspectives. The Center of Food Safety and Nutrition thinks very differently than the Center of Veterinary Medicine. And if anyone here has submitted a GRAS for both human and food, you'll understand. There's very different perspectives there. And I guess there are 3 distinct pathways to compliance. 2 are for federal level, GRAS and FAP, and 1 for state compliance. And the SHA does not extend to animal feed. And AAFCO definition is not a federal compliance pathway. And it's based on a memorandum of understanding by CVM and FDA, CVM and AAFCO. Okay, now to the recommendations. What is the best path for my novel feed ingredient? I guess it depends, huh? Our favorite answer as consultants is it depends. And even with my answers now, there will be more exceptions, and there are more exceptions, and so many. Anyway, so I'll start with that theory. So the dossier format, information is compiled in accordance with 21 CFR 571, and publication requirement, which is very key. The data does not have to be published, which is a very tactical tool for many companies. And that's because if it's not published, if the data is not published, no one can really find it unless they submit a FOIA, which is a Freedom of Information Act request. And those take a long time, so you probably will never get it. But this is one major distinguishing factor for an FAP versus other pathways. It doesn't have to be published. So I guess the approval method is different too. It's reviewed by the CVM. And if you have to do everything from scratch with studies as well as drafting dossier, if you hire a consultant or something, it'll likely be $360K to $500,000 if you have to do it from scratch. So not cheap. And unfortunately, it's also very long, and approximately 5 to 8 years or more to receive approval from our experience. And so if we look at pros and cons, approval process results in federal regulation that is accepted by all states, meaning you don't have to deal with individual states or, yeah, basically, I think that's probably the biggest deal. You can just get it out there in federal level, all the states accept it. And you don't have to you're not required to publish safety data. Now the cons, long time to approval, and in spite of repeated statements from CVM stating quality, quantity, and quality supporting data as FAP or as a GRAS and FAP, study requirements are often more stringent. It's not that there's more to do to show safety. It's more that other options give you the flexibility to be more focused on your study backing. Whereas FAP is a little bit more checklist, and you have a lot of feedback and suggestions, quote unquote, from CVM, which can lead easily to $50,000 to $100,000 more in study requirements. Anyway, but it's pretty good. FAPs are the most straightforward path to achieving FDA compliance. However, they're the most conservative and can often result in a long approval process and expensive studies. FAPs work best for companies that want a surefire solution, have very deep pockets, and can afford to wait. If you're in a rush, I do not recommend this pathway. However, AFIA has been working very hard to get CVM more resources, so maybe it'll get faster. Don't know. Anyway, this is also good for companies that have an ingredient to be used at a high concentration. Once you start getting up there in concentration, you kind of put yourself out there as a risk. CVM might pay more attention to you, as well as controversial ingredients. Hemp, I'm looking at you. That's probably a good place for you to start. Anyway, self-affirmed GRAS, that's another section of GRAS. So I guess what I mean by self-affirmed GRAS, as opposed to, a CVM notified GRAS, is that self-affirmed GRAS is the GRAS that you do not send to the FDA and you keep it. You don't notify to the FDA, you just have the expert panel review it. So the dossier format is you're having a narrative showing safety with adherence to FDA substances generally recognized as safe final rule, published August 17, 2016. Excuse me. And unlike FAP, you have to publish your studies in a peer-reviewed journal. The safety studies. Not everything must be published, just the core safety studies. Typical target animal species studies, genotox, that kind of thing. So approval method is you don't have to get the FDA. In this case, we're not. We are sending it just to the expert panel. And then once you have their approval, you take it to the individual states that you want to get approval to. So, we can talk about that in a little bit. And or having AAFCO approve the definition, which is in many ways still notifying to CVM because CVM's there. They're part of it. So estimated cost with studies, optimistically is $360K. So like FAP, it's probably going to be around the same. But FAP has kind of a higher ceiling, I believe. And the reason why self-affirmed GRAS or GRAS period gives you the flexibility to be more focused with your study battery. That's about it. The quality and quantity, or the quality of the data, will still show safety in use. You have a little more free will. The time to approval would if you had to do studies and draft everything to get an expert panel approve it, 14 months. And if you take it to the states, you have a bunch of states, it'll probably take you about 4 months too. So about 18 months total. So much faster than FAPs. So pros and cons. So once again, choice of studies is often at the discretion of independent experts who must shoulder the responsibility for the decision. Process is less expensive, more and shorter timeline than FAP. Can sometimes get to market faster if states accept the self-affirmed GRAS dossier, and that's if they accept the self-affirmed GRAS dossier. And because you're not notifying it to CVM, you are bypassing the high rejection rate from CVM, which is around 60%. I think I mentioned this already, but I'll read it anyway. I wrote it down twice. Study requirements are more targeted and less pro forma box checking than FAP. And I guess it's a matter of having data that is need to know versus nice to have. Nice to have could result in $100,000 more. So that's important to know. So cons, you have to get approval from individual states. You have to take it to them. And some states require GRAS dossiers to be notified to CVM. And some states claim not to have the expertise to examine a GRAS or the funds to subcontract work. And the state officials are very busy. They have a lot of responsibility, so I completely understand. It makes sense. But, I guess another thing that's important to note, well, I guess talk about next slide. But when dealing with GRAS, you have to notify the CVM to be federally compliant. So why do it? However, because many states require CVM notification, it can sometimes be difficult to avoid notification. Not only that, a lot of your clients might also want you to notify your GRAS. So it's really almost kind of a tactical business decision whether you decide to notify. Self-affirmed GRAS works best for companies whose primary clients exist in states that are open to receiving self-affirmed GRAS, and states that are, your clients are in that are very specific. If you're going to be selling to poultry producers and your clients are all in Georgia, just see if you try to do self-affirmed GRAS first. It might be faster. But you do have that risk of states saying no, and you increase your chances, I found, if you hire good attorneys or if you have a good legal department. If you're interested in solid legal work, check out Todd Harrison at Venable. Very good guy. Okay, CVM notified GRAS. So as I mentioned, we had GRAS earlier, which is self-affirmed. Now we're talking about notified GRAS. Same dossier format as earlier. Must be published. The approval method is different though. Expert panel review. It's already GRAS after that. However, you notify the FDA. And that makes things a little bit more expensive. But in terms of time to approval, it makes it a lot longer. So instead of, I think it was 14 months. I'm not sure. I think on the previous slide, but it almost doubles or adds a third of time from project initiation to CVM approval to get something on the market because of that. So when it comes to CVM notified GRAS, the pros are shorter timeline to market than FAP. It's longer in some ways than the self-affirmed. And notification will allow for federal compliance, overcoming many states' complaints. So much like an FAP, if you notify the GRAS, the states will accept it. Now, I guess the biggest con of this is that CVM is not very open to CVM or to notify GRAS, and there seems to be a 60% rejection rate, and most of the ones that make it through are, low-level abuse ingredients such as processing aids. So there is a risk to notifying GRAS. So once again, sometimes you don't have a choice. When dealing with GRAS, this option is the straightforward solution, as notification results in federal compliance. However, when notifying, you are subjected to potentially high notification rejection rates, long review times, and the potential for increased study requirements. Again, CVM notified GRAS works best for companies that have clients in multiple states that will not accept the self-affirmed GRAS and prefer a national approach to their approval. It's kind of a little bit less conservative FAP and faster time to market, but it will take care of that federal compliance. Okay, AAFCO. Well, it according to AAFCO OP, in short. But in terms of content, you still need to have similar content as GRAS or FAP. You need the scientific data. However, there doesn't appear to be a publication requirement, so that's also kind of big. So it's approved by IDC, Ingredient Definition Committee, then it goes to membership, and then you get temporary definition. 6 months later, it goes through the same process, and definition becomes permanent, finalized. Now, because CVM has insisted that AAFCO definitions, GRAS, and FAPs must have the same quality and content, quality and quantity of safety data, we feel that it should be around $360,000, depending on studies if you have to do them. I think the figures I've been showing you would probably be a good reflection of a target animal study in poultry. And let's just say that the bigger animals get, the more expensive they get. So be prepared for that. So time to approval is around 6 months for temporary approval and another 6 months for permanent approval. So I think that's important. Tack on another 12 to 14 months I forgot to add for any studies you have to do. So pros and cons, often cheaper, easier, faster than an FAP, and it's commonly accepted method by industry for 100 years. Publication is not necessary. It will prevent others from using your data. Good. Cons are it's not federally compliant, and the validity and the validity is dependent on the memorandum of understanding between AAFCO and CVM. So basically, you're staking it on this letter, saying that we're not going to enforce it. So it's kind of a risky thing to get an AAFCO definition, because if they pull the memorandum of understanding, your definitions are kind of in free fall, and we don't know where they're going to land. So even another con is even if it was approved by IDC, it must still receive final approval by CVM. And CVM has stated that of the three pathways, GRAS, AAFCO, and FAP, AAFCO definitions are the lowest priority. So this option can be viable if there are already similar definitions within OP, or if you want to amend an existing definition. However, because the basis of compliance for the AAFCO OP's MOU is the Memorandum of Understanding, there's a risk of losing status being compliant with federal regulations. Well, I guess it's not technically, but it's something that is a risk to your ingredient. So what does it work best for? Companies that want to amend an existing OP definition or pursuing approval of similar approved ingredients. Okay, so I guess this is a summary of recommendations. All options can be viable in different contexts. FAPs are the most conservative and least risky ingredient approval, but they can result in long wait times and additional studies. Self-affirmed GRAS can work well if your clients are in a state that is amenable to self-affirmed GRAS, but that's not always guaranteed. And you have to take it state by state. CVM notified GRAS is a viable pathway. However, you have to weigh that with a high CVM rejection rate. And AAFCO definitions are the best option when you're trying to amend an existing definition. Because of that MOU, you want to make sure that you're hedging your risk against that. Okay, that's it. And before I open the floor for questions and listen to you all, there is another webinar that we're planning on doing. It's going to be by my colleague, Tatiana Burdock, and she's going to be talking about the regulatory hurdles associated with cannabis and its concentrates. It's going to be Thursday, May 21st. So stay tuned. We will keep you posted, and it'd be great if you joined us again. Thanks very much. All right. Any questions? I will wait. Please type them out. Okay, I think I'm getting a few. My screen doesn't show them very well, so I can't see it. Okay. Okay. Which states do not accept self-affirmed GRAS? Where can you find this info? I got from somebody. Well, it's not that a state. Well, there are some states that are more amenable to others. It's more of the regulators themselves who's open to it. And I know that we have a list somewhere in our records, but of states that are regulators that are amenable, state regulators. But you know, the law is, I mean, we're not lawyers, so you should talk to legal counsel. But in our opinion, there should be no reason why you shouldn't be able to accept this off from GRAS, because it's federal regulation, and that supersedes state. But once again, you know, it really depends on the individual that you're dealing with. And if you have a good legal basis, a lot of states will be more amenable. So it really depends, because I think certain states would say yes if there was good enough persuasion. But if there's not, they would probably say no. Okay, let's see. Okay. Oh, that was from Kim. Okay. Okay, so another question. Do GRAS notices always have to be reviewed by an expert panel? Can you just perform your literature search, draft a dossier, and that's it? Well, you know, it's a lot of GRAS comes down to guidances by CVM or FDA, as well as industry best practices. And with that, I mean, I'd say yes, you should have an expert panel review it. Industry standard is 3. Then 3 well-qualified expert panelists, but some people have done 2. But you can perform your literature search, you can draft this dossier, but you still should have an expert panelist review it, especially if you're going to take it state to state. You're going to need that. Okay, let's see. I don't know why this is so small. I can't see question. Which states? Okay, we talked about that already. I think we have a list somewhere, but if you'd like to talk to us about it, please shoot us an email. Wow, that's a really popular question. That's the 3rd time I got that. So if you guys want to talk about that further, I mean, I'd have to look it up. And, you know, once again, the more legal firepower you have, legal chops, it kind of makes it easier. So we're not lawyers, but we might be able to help you, at least with the correspondence. Did the estimated the costs for different pathways include consulting fees, expert panel fees, or just the studies? Yes, they included everything in terms of drafting dossier, expert panel, studies, the works. So yes, they did. And if I were you, I would look at them as if they were poultry studies or poultry dossiers. So that's kind of in kind of sobering realization, that's entry level. So it goes up from there, and you know, bigger the animal, the more expensive the target animal study. And so that's just important to note. Okay, Rajiv from India has 2 questions. Let's see, I don't see it. Okay, Rajiv, I'm sorry, I don't see your questions. Will the slide deck be available afterwards? I think we can make that happen. Let me check. How far along is FDA with including AAFCO ingredients in CFR? Oh man, you know, there are so many. I wish I had a better answer to this question, but I understand. I'm not sure if that's still being pushed forward. I think we're all kind of just accepting the MOU for what it is right now, and we're just trying to work on having CVM have more resources so that we can move forward with having GRASs be the primary, GRAS or FAPs be the primary reviewer instead of AAFCO, but I'm not sure. That's something we can definitely talk about. Oh, it's Sophie. Hey, Sophie. Okay. 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 Is there any current or future conversations for AAFCO regulators to develop a platform to assess self-affirmed GRAS? I'm not sure what you mean by platform to assess self-affirmed GRAS. When I think of assessing a GRAS as a regulator, I think when it comes to AAFCO, they are really trying to defer to CVM. I know AFIA, American Association, American Feed, AFIA, but they're the ones. We're all trying to get more funding to FDA to help them, right? To help them assess GRAS notifications and to give more resources. I'm not sure if how much AAFCO is involved in that. That's a good question. What is the safety data set required for aqua poultry feed? Toxicological study in which animals should be used. Well, safety data set. That's a loaded question. When you get into poultry feed, and I'm not too familiar with aqua feed, you typically can't have a very controlled environment when it comes to poultry. And what you do to compensate for a very controlled environment is to have a very large sample size. So you have a couple thousand poultry, some poultry, and then you do the feed, and then you do some quite a bit of analysis on that. But it's something that I wish I knew more about right now off the top of my head. But good question. Once again, we're going to try to save these questions and answer them, as much as we can. Obviously, it'd be better if we can get Dr. Burdock in here and Ray to help me out a bit. But yeah, there's a lot of good questions here, and we'll try to answer as many as we can, individually engage with y'all. Okay. Okay, so once again, this individual is talking about drug claims versus keeping them as animal feed ingredients. I guess the rule of thumb there is it increasing production? Is it, I know it's really difficult to wrap your mind around increasing production because that is such a conservative and limiting definition or a limiting box for marketing. And CVM is very conservative with that. And they're basically saying that, hey, if this food causes your animal to grow, that's a drug. And we all know that that's not a drug, but the regulation and how it's been interpreted is basically stating that. So it's kind of a difficult way to work with claims. Okay, well, we're out of time today. I'm just about out of voice. I really appreciate all of you guys coming out and filling up this webinar. It's really exciting for us to have a good turnout with this. Hope you found it useful. And once again, you have our information here. You can contact us at info@burdockgroup.com. One of us will respond to you within 24 hours, and we can engage with you there. And we'll try to take a look at these questions and answer them and try to engage and reconnect with you all if you are still interested, and as well as find a way to get this webinar video out so you guys can see it. So with that, thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful day. Be safe. Wash your hands.